Okay, so you're going third.
Okay, good.
After Molly.
Okay.
And all right, where's the mic? And you have to talk into the microphone really close for the recording. Where is it? Okay, cool. Let me a little memo with everyone's thoughts. 1 second.
Yes. Cool.
All right, we're going to start now. Okay.
For everyone that's coming in, even though we changed the room number, the hashtag will remain the same. So we're going to stay at hashtag B4, even though you're in C. Cool.
All right, we're good. So we're going to kind of go get started fast. If you notice what's different about this panel, there are 5. And most of the other ones have 4, so it's kind of like overload. So it's going to be a little fast talking because we want to get time to have them talk to each other, and we can all have some questions about photography and visual culture. And I was convinced that the emoji actually said something. I was just making fun of me because I couldn't figure it out. But no, it's just a bunch of bangs. So with that, my name is Benjamen Walker. I'm the presider for this one. And we are going to start out with Creech, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism at Temple University. Uses post-structuralist theory to study the areas where journalism, technology, and public discourse overlap.
Thanks. Thank you very much. The title of my presentation is Technology, Power, and Representation, and I'm focusing in, and it comes from a long-term concern about what is the actual power that we can ascribe to representation. And one of the ways I walk through this and think about it as sort of a preamble to this is to think about representation as if all of its constituent meanings can be acted at once. A representation of an event as well as representation as in representing your own politics and self in a process. So without further ado, amid the social and political upheavals of recent years, the cell phone camera has gained a particular kind of social agency. During the Arab Spring protests of 2011, commentators in academia and the mainstream media argued that these devices offered a new form of social organization that presaged democratic mobilization and governance. Elsewhere, in Camden public parks, Occupy Wall Street protesters documented their movement and its politics, as well as key moments of conflict between the police and protesters. However, as time passed and revelations about the US government's surveillance across mobile devices were revealed, popular commentary began to construct the cell phone camera as a site of compromised potential. The popular consensus shift away from the cell phone camera as a completely emancipatory device reveals a key analytic problematic often encountered in the cultural studies of communication devices. They are either inscribed within the overdetermining forces of late capitalism or act as beacons of rhizomatic potentiality, pointing toward a new politics of possibility. In order to escape this analytic binary rooted in techno-determinism and optimism and pessimism, this essay puts forth a line of analysis which may allow critical scholars to begin to analyze the cell phone camera and other communication devices as containing both technological and cultural possibility within prescribed limits. In order to do so, I propose a schema that posits the cell phone camera as an apparatus embedded within contemporary social relations with a specific agency that emerges from the productive tension between its technological capability and the cultural practices that it is used to both augment and disrupt. As a cell phone camera's key functionality lies in its ability to produce and distribute images, the purpose of this project is twofold. First, it offers a foundation for investigating a technologically situated means of representation, while secondly, giving a voice to the productive tension between technological capability and cultural practice. And so, my argument identifies 3 key areas of practice: image production, distribution, and capture. And this is really what I'm going to spend a brief amount of time dwelling on in front of you today. And so for the analysis and theorization of the cell phone camera, this means attempting to track the broad field of forces, technical capabilities, and strategic deployments that not only grant meaning to the device, but also inscribe the possibilities it offers human actors. Such a wide-ranging project is obviously indebted to Bruno Latour, whose most recent work attempts to rigorously and empirically account for not just the agency of individual devices, but the web of relations that circulate around devices, offering a means for impacting the various areas of representation, practice, and thus power. For instance, a single cell phone video, as the examples I have here, may reveal the workings of police power in ways that may not have been properly understood before, and as the video circulates among broader technological networks, it enters into other realms and relations of practice, i.e. journalism, politics, legal structures, which then have to account for any ontological rearrangement a video may produce. It is with this sense of scale in mind that I go through my analysis. I'm just going to jump ahead to begin talking about the technical capabilities of production. And the key point here is that the body of a cell phone camera conceals complex practices. And in doing so, discrete technological advancements over the past decade can proliferate across primarily consumer-driven networks. That's the particular power of the cell phone camera, is the broad uptake and the fact that complicated processes that not only convert light to a digital image via a very limited light chip, but also compact those images into a binary space that can be sent across networks, give rise to certain social and cultural practices that extend from there. The key point here is to think about how simplified interfaces within commercial markets lead to productive limits, which invite new forms of use. And the example that I like to go to is the work of Damon Winter at the New York Times, I'm so sorry, whose work documenting soldiers in Afghanistan won several awards in 2011. And it's worth turning to a quote from him in order to contextualize this. He says, "I think any discussion on the validity of these images, these particular images, comes down to two basic fundamentals, aesthetics and content. At the heart of all these photos is a moment or a detail or an expression that tells the story of these soldiers' day-to-day lives while on a combat mission. Nothing can change that. No content has been added, taken away, obscured, or altered. These are remarkably straightforward and simple images. Some consider the use of the phone camera as a gimmick for aestheticizing news photos. I think that those are fair arguments to make, but those arguments have nothing to do with the content of the photos. We are not walking photocopiers. We are storytellers. We observe, we choose moments, we frame little slices of our world with our viewfinders. We even decide how much or how little light will illuminate our subjects. And yes, we choose what equipment to use, and through all of these decisions, we shape the way a story is told." But none of this is possible without networks of distribution that are also localized within the borders and the boundaries of the device, and often represented through easy-to-click, single-button apps that are essentially bridge the binary data of a photo, of a video, into broad-scale networks. The key point here is it continues to mask complexities of technical operations within a consumer device. The simplification within the boundaries of a consumer device create a very specific social condition. And this is really where the meat and the rubber hits the road, is how do we think about the social construction of image capture now, the conditions under which images can and will be produced. And so there are some antecedents that allow us to think about the cell phone camera, surveillance projects where conspicuous cameras are purposely deployed to invert the relations of power. Occupy protests extend from a different genealogy of representation that carry a larger resonance there. But Ferguson protests, I think, should also be considered as something very different than Occupy protests. The bigger point here is that each deployment has its own conditions of existence. And the representations themselves are not singular in any sense of emancipatory politics, but have a specific context under which they make sense. And any sense of power can then be theorized or linked to a form of representation. But I will say there's two material conditions that become social conditions, and that is the deployment, the actual existence of cameras in so many pockets around the world lead to a sense of ubiquity, and from that ubiquity extends another constituent practice that I would call granularity, i.e. the fact that so much of social reality has the potential to be reported in such specific detail. And one way this works is that it creates a regime where the power of first-person witnessing may be amplified and granted power and meaning within separate contexts, i.e. if the camera is deployed specifically as a document device. But I think we all have to also deal with the consequences of images in the context in which they exist. Down here at the bottom right, I have the front cover of the New York Post on a very sad day, and it points to one particular problem with treating cameras as a sovereign witnessing camera videos as a sovereign witnessing document, is we have to account for the way in which they are treated as evidence in different contexts. Though they may mobilize bodies in streets and protests under legal strictures and structures, those rules also work to confine and limit power. But others have looked in more positive ways at the way in which images are able to mobilize and have the affect or the effect of gathering bodies in streets in ways, creating what Paulo Garbato has called a rhetoric of solidarity that leads a sort of force of presence to these political projects. But one way I like to think about it and find really useful comes from the terms of Kevin DeLuca. This is the problem of an analog presentation in a digital setting. In the terms of Kevin DeLuca, his quote about Occupy protesters basically distills down to, with a single smartphone in her pocket, an Occupied activist camping in Zuccotti Park or Chicago or Oakland can become a pan-media outlet, a decentered knot of video, photographs, and blogging that documents and creates and circulates the Occupied event. And thus maybe in that context we can begin to point to some sense of possibility, if we then also account for the conditions under which that possibility is also constrained. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Our next presenter is Molly Crabapple. She's an artist and writer in New York. Her memoir, Drawing Blood, will be published by HarperCollins in November 2015. It's called An Emblem of the Way Art Can Break Out of the Gilded Gallery by the New Republic. She has drawn in Guantanamo Bay, Abu Dhabi, migrant labor camps, and with rebels in Syria. Crabapple is a contributing editor for Vice. She's written for publications including the New York Times, Paris Review, and Vanity Fair, and her work is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art.
Hey, I'm Molly. Last year, Jezebel published unretouched outtakes of Lady Gaga's Versace campaign. Without Photoshop, Gaga's wig was more wig-like, her makeup flat beige, but she was the same skinny, strong-nosed chameleon that Stephanie Germanetta had always been. The outtakes were not interesting, but showing celebrities without Photoshop is Jezebel's brand. Jezebel exploded in popularity in 2007 by offering a $10,000 bounty for originals of Faith Hill's Red Book cover. The raw photos proved the magazine had liquefied the star's waist, softened her nasolabial folds, and brutalized her elbow into a bendy tube. This January, with more controversy, Jezebel paid another $10,000 for the originals of Lena Dunham's Vogue cover shoot. Those revealed only a tidy dress. Jezebel's is a feminism that seeks its scapegoat in altered images. To refrain from Photoshop is girl-positive marketing gold. The Dove campaign for real beauty delights itself by putting out fake filters that chide her touchers. Magazines sign no Photoshop pledges. Clothing companies crow that they have never taken a clone stamp to their models' thighs. To these feminists, Photoshop is to blame for unrealistic body standards, for poor self-esteem, for anorexia in teen girls. The campaign against Photoshop is the perfect cause for the white middle-class woman whose primary problem is feeling that their bodies do not match with an increasingly surreal and impossible media ideal. Photoshop, the belief goes, takes a true record of a moment and turns it into an oppressive lie. But fuck Photoshop. Photos are already lies. I'm a former model and a current artist, and I've learned this truth every second I've stared into the camera's insect eye. Anyone who's been at a photo shoot knows that even unretouched photos bear only the scantest resemblance to their subject. A photo is frozen. A model sweats and bloats, ages and dies. Framing is a lie, lighting is a lie, cropping is a lie. When you suck in your stomach or turn your head so the light washes out your laugh lines, you are lying as much as any liquefy tool. Untruth is baked into the process. Photographer Srita McFadden wrote last year on BuzzFeed about how the chemical makeup of some films was biased against dark skin tones. Even snapshots often don't look like you, because you are not static. You are a three-dimensional being torn by time. Photos are pixel ghosts. Photos are lies because art is a lie. Art is artifice. Art makes things as they are not, only occasionally in the service of greater truths. The subject desires flattery. The viewer desires truth. The photographer must decide what each means, tweeted photographer Clayton Cubitt. To pose is to be vulnerable. Because of the photo's presumable reality, viewers experience the subject as the image maker crafts him or her to be. The model's beauty can be a product, as in a fashion shoot. Other times, as in a Diane Arbus photo, the product is the model's marginalization or her pain. The relationship between the photographer and the model is war as often as love. The winner is the person who holds the release. Those who see Photoshop as a misogynistic corruption of photography seldom have interesting ideas about what a feminist photo might look like. Dove's famous ad showing real women in their underwear, and by real they mean smooth-skinned, able-bodied, and fleshy, but not fat, is as wholesome as vitamin-enriched Wonder Bread. Blogs denounce American Apparel for showing pubic hair. But if minimal Photoshop makes you feminist, American Apparel is as feminist as Audre Lorde. Without photographic artifice, women who are conventionally perfect remain so. Photoshop's victim is supposed to be the real girl, whatever that means, presumably feminine, insecure, someone who does not work in sex, performance, or fashion industries. Does trickery-free hotness make this real girl feel better or worse? Photoshop is often done badly. In deadline hell, humans get spliced into chimeras. Models lose limbs, their rib cages are broken, and they gain additional thumbs. Photos in glossy magazines are often little more than paintings. Posed meat space is one shade of paint. Perhaps impressionable girls would feel better if magazines printed drawings instead to make the unreality explicit. It's certainly better for my bank account. Photography was no sooner touched than it was retouched. Photoshop's scalpel and airbrush are the descendants of real tools used to pretty up printed photography. Back then, images of stars seldom ran unretouched. Columbia Pictures plucked back Margarita Carmen Cancino's hairline to erase her Hispanic heritage. She became Rita Hayworth. Now she's immortal in silver gelatin. You don't notice how Vaseline, airbrush, and darkroom manipulation worked on her miraculous bone structure. Anything extraneous dissolved into black and white. To get a quote-unquote true photo, you need to remove artifice, and this means removing art. Art's opposite is bulk surveillance. Drones, CCTV, ultra-fast, ultra-high-res DSLR, our fingers stroking our iPhones or tapping on the now discontinued Google Glass. Omnipresent cameras suction up reality without curation. We're at the finest time in history to see stars, or anyone, photographed looking like hell. For women, this surveillance is far harsher than posed artificiality. Under the regime of the phone cam, you must be ever photo-ready. Never wrinkle your forehead, never let your belly out, never make an awkward face. When Jezebel pays for leaks of raw photos, they mirror tabloids that mock famous cellulite. Noble justifications aside, both rip away a woman's control over her own image. Both profit off of non-consensual exposure. Behind both is a nasty whisper. You pretended to be perfect. We caught you. You're not. Like art, glamour begins at pretending. Its lips painted red, waist corseted thin. Historically, glamour is derived from witchcraft. It can deceive a man into thinking a woman he chose was beautiful, fertile, and young. Beauty is born, but glamour is made. For a woman to make herself is to seek a station above her own. Retouching is post hoc glamour. Pixel shellac images like makeup on a face. From Photoshop to Instagram, each tech iteration has made retouching more democratic and more despised. The self-facing phone cam is a masterclass in how posing affects perception. Media concern trolls Photoshop's effects on teen girls. Meanwhile, teen girls use iPhone retouching apps to construct media of themselves. A teen girl knows the lies behind photography best, but when she takes selfies, she's teaching herself what were once trade secrets. Now she's the one who angles, crops, and blurs. The girl she leaves on the screen is and is not the girl who took the picture. Like all photos, the girl on the screen is a shadow. She's a mirage, to place those that corporations once sold to her creator. She is false, but also she's true. Thank you, guys.
So, you can actually go for 15 minutes. Annamarie runs an American Studies doctoral student at Penn State University, and she is interested in the intersections of popular culture, visual culture, technology, and identity. She's published an article on depictions of motherhood in comics and image text, a chapter on the performance of Japanese femininity online in popular culture in the 21st century, and has presented her work at various conferences, including the West Coast version of this, the San Diego International Comic Con.
Thank you. Okay, so for my presentation today, I'm going to be describing to you the use of screenshots to present the self. And I'm going to be specifically looking at a sort of subgenre of these screenshots of text messages that I'm calling the unsent text. So overall, we're going to be looking at like the visual properties. So there are lots of pictures that you can take a look at over there. So here's an example of an unsent text right here. You can see it's to be sent to secret love, and there's this sort of conversation that happens that's sort of casual, but there's a unsent text message that's screenshotted that is going beyond the sort of casual interaction that they're having. So what I'm looking at is the way in which these kinds of images have a form of authenticity and subjectivity that's actually validated by the ideas of indexicality or documentation, as well of the screenshot as a medium, as well as the interiority and intimacy that's afforded by the idea of text messaging, and the idea of documenting your performance. So, move on. I'm going to gloss over this because you guys might be familiar. Indexicality, with regards to photography, has to do with the idea that photographs are referring to a real, the real events in which that they're depicting, and there are lots of examples of how this truth claim that's afforded to photographs is still translated to screenshots. For instance, I have the example of By Felipe, which is where women are screenshotting pictures of angry men, basically, who felt rejected by them in order to sort of bring attention to the treatment of women on particularly like dating sites, I believe. As well as I have up here a screenshot of somebody who is discussing a screenshot of the Sandy Hook conspiracy, the idea that there is evidence that, based on the screenshot, that the memorial page for one of the victims was actually made before the person was killed. So obviously people are really invested in the idea of screenshots as something that can prove things in an intense way. So These are just some important quotes about indexicality in terms of photography, dating back to the 1890s, in which there was the idea that photographs are able to document because of the mechanical means that they rely on, they're able to represent exactly the objects that they represent. And this was obviously questioned later on. There's the idea that this credibility is actually something that is assumed but not real. By the time you get to the 70s and 80s, you have a lot of art critics and cultural theorists talking about the active manufacturing of photographs and the idea that these are constructed renderings that are produced within a power structure framework. So, and actually, I'm gonna go back to this image for a second. This I just made based on faking your iPhone messages, like web app, that allows you to change all sorts of different things about your text message screenshot that you are able to copy from the site. So you see at the top, there's the carrier. You can choose the carrier. You can choose the percentage of your battery, et cetera, et cetera. All sort of proving this idea that these things are expressive, potentially, in people's minds. So why is texting so ubiquitous in the screenshots that are circulated on, for instance, Instagram or Tumblr, and some other sites as well? Aside from game screenshots and things from mass media, definitely the text message or the mobile phone interface is a very popular subject. So when I was looking to sort of understand this, I found a really cool quote that was describing the intimacy of texting, that, according to Matlock, like photography, texting acts as a mechanical record, but texting also gives space to intimate, private languages that are impossible to capture on the public surface of the photograph. The vernacular grammar of text messaging develops partly as a response to its limitations, but also to its intimacy. The text message is a note passed from hand to hand in a classroom, a secret rather than an announcement. And so this intimacy is really interestingly transformed when it's used as a screenshot device. And the vast majority of text message screenshots that are circulated have a emotional content that is not the same as the unsent text message. Most are actual conversations or assumed to be actual conversations. You can think along the lines of like autocorrect fails or that sort of thing. Also, it's very popular for people to screenshot photos of their, or to capture conversations that they've had with their friends and say things like, oh, isn't she the best? So they're very positive things, but within the unsent text message, there's usually an emotional content that's much more focused on loneliness and sadness or anger, which I think has something to do with the idea of the moment that it's capturing. So I was looking at the ways in which this expression comes through the screenshots, as well as a sort of narrative that emerges. And there are lots of different ways that you can see this. You can look at the text itself, the textual content. You can look at the names that are used, often euphemistic, sometimes directly calling somebody out, sometimes not addressed to anybody. You can also look at the time in which it's supposed to be sent, the sort of chronological setting of the text, as well as the different choices in image display and the choices to use the text and the texting interface as an image itself. So there are post-production things that you can look at, as well as the actual, the image itself as is. So this one is to the guy I really like. I like you a lot. I hope you like me too, but I'm too scared to ever tell you. So you see this as some text that somebody entered and screenshot, but has yet to send. And there doesn't appear to be any text messages to the guy that they really like. So there's this lack of sort of exposition that maybe is an exposition in itself. Another example of this, where you can kind of look at maybe the visual qualities a little bit more. Somebody chose to address this to Sunshine, I miss you so much, another broken heart. And in this, the use of emoji obviously emerges, but also this sort of blankness and sparity of the image itself, I think is like an interesting aesthetic that I think has to do a lot with the idea of the sort of minimalist interface and font choices that are supposed to sort of convey a clarity or a lack of decoration, and therefore a lack of the sort of expressive content, something that's more objective or mechanically produced. And, and also the time on this, 1:34 a.m., so this, you could imagine, might be somebody laying in bed at night, thinking about the one that they're missing. And then this one here, this one has more of the angry content, and it's addressed to Fuckhead. And you said you couldn't imagine being with anybody else. You said you loved me multiple times and kissed me multiple times. I'm done, There's this sort of angry thing that's presented here. There's also the cursor in both of these images. So you can see that it's sort of like the trace of the person's hand itself. And then there are also people who have circulated, their responses to this as any sort of widely utilized visual form. And so this is an example of a hand-drawn one. And I would argue that there are particular visual qualities about the screenshot interface that are not transferred well to these hand-drawn ones. So while this has similar content, no, don't talk to me, you're gonna just bring back shitloads of memories, and what else will bring back feelings, et cetera, et cetera. Similar idea, it's referencing clearly the screenshot of the text message itself. However, the lack of these indexical qualities of a screenshot creates a sort of disconnect with the idea. You can see the process and the arrangement rather than this idea of capturing a moment in time. So obviously, a lot of these text messages are clearly staged. So in this one, this was actually circulated. I didn't make this one. I didn't make any besides the beginning one, and FYI. Okay, so can I ask you one thing? Did I mean anything to you? And then the person's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then, can you just play along? This is for Tumblr. So there's this idea that people are reacting to, that there's a clear staging in these images. However, I think that doesn't really diminish the iconicity of the images themselves and their signifying potential. In fact, maybe the editing makes it more expressive in a way, especially that idea of the authentic and inner self. And this precarious line that's made between the potential and actual interaction comes to a forefront with the idea of documenting the performance of the text. So this sort of familiar anxiety about accidentally sending the text to the wrong person or double tapping some image that you didn't mean to double tap and like, which people sort of can relate to, and this creates this precarious line. So these were actually originally animated, but you can't see them right now. So these ones are like animated, and they show the act of texting itself. They depict that, which is kind of cool and interesting variation on the form. And the one at the bottom, the person, they say, "Are you okay?" And the person begins saying, "No," and then he raises it to say, "Nothing," or something like that. So there's this idea of the texter erasing the true sentiment, or being able to depict the true sentiment via this form. So there's the vulnerability that's expressed through this, and the idea that there's a desire to express your inner self if it weren't for these external forces that are acting upon you, which makes it really great for melodramatic sort of teen emo content, which I won't get into in this presentation. But. Oh, it's going. Cool. There's one. Is this one good? Yeah, not at all. No? I'm fine. Okay. So there are lots of different ways that this is used, and interestingly, though, the unsent text tends to really be focused on this expression of the true, authentic inner self, and I think that the idea of indexicality with regard to digital media is interestingly played upon with this. So some people have talked about how with digital images there's a loss of that sort of truth claim because of the questionable sources or the potential for, obviously, alteration. However, this is still definitely used as a visual sort of signification in these images. And there's an idea that the material production is buried with these. However, there's definitely, I don't know, I just really like this one here. This one is a sent text message that was portrayed. Potentially, though, faked. I don't know. This one says, "Why are you still here?" Because I cared. Because I've turned down 4 prom invitations, etc. This attempts to sort of connect or to express oneself in a public sphere is very important. And so there are lots of newer or variations on these. This one is there's a whole account for unsent Snapchats by Wasted Snap. This one says, "Can't stop thinking about you." And this has an even greater sense of ephemerality because of the snapshot medium as a medium. And there are people who play specifically with their phone interfaces to create these, changing their autocorrect settings, etc. So overall, in conclusion, I would like to suggest that the construction of the unsent text message is able to, through its evoking of intimacy and indexicality, it can guarantee an authenticity to the voice of the creator. And its performativity, combined with this, coalesces to give words that are presented in the text a clear voice that wouldn't be afforded to a handwritten or typed out post. So in this way, the creator or circulator becomes the subject and is representing subjectivity. It's just not communicated through the text, it's through all these other forms. And to sort of just give a brief, okay, sorry. This is it. I was just going to say there's avoidance on this too. Thank you.
So, Pamela,
Liou
is next. Sorry. Is a computational designer, writer, and technologist. She's currently a master's candidate at ITC, a former production engineer at Shapeways. Pamela has worked alongside a team of technicians to find solutions for mass
gonna need a minute. Okay. Sorry guys, setting up a new thing.
We're definitely gonna have time for a Q&A. It's the one and a half X. Yeah, you almost ruined it. But we're gonna make it.
All right. Great. It's a little precarious. All right. Hello. My name is Pamela Liou, and today I want to talk to you about your face. Specifically, the image of your face that you carry inside your mind, and also the image that others carry of you as well. My co-author, Kate Godwin, and I tasked ourselves with reconstructing our face as seen through an algorithm, specifically an algorithm that's used to query for pornographic content. So I wanted to begin my talk with a quote from John Berger, art critic, and in his Ways of Seeing, he said, "The social presence of women is developed as a result of their ingenuity in living under such tutelage within such limited space. But this has, at the cost, the woman's self being split into two. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself." So as a mechanism for dealing with the maneuverability within our limits that are imposed on us, we have cleaved ourselves multiple times, splintering ourselves in multiple recursive images and feedback loops. This is exacerbated by technology. And for instance, if we take a look at what is within our purview and what is not within our purview, we can find that there's very, very murky territory that's only now being discovered. Specifically, we are entering an age where we can manipulate any image, render it into 3D, 3 dimensions, and do with it what we like. Now, Kate and I wanted to explore the murky territories of ownership as well, and it looks as though we don't really have ownership over the image of ourselves. We actually consensually distribute it freely through Facebook, through LinkedIn, through other social media platforms. One area of tension is the domain of imagination. Anyone is free to pose you in whatever compromising position you like within their imagination. A woman's consent has no sovereignty in another person's mind. So as an anticipatory exercise, we attempted to reconstruct our identities. These identities that were previously obfuscated from our view. Kate and I decided to take a look at the kind of cultural landscape that we were entering, and we wanted to focus a little bit at the impetus of our investigation, which is certain recent precedents with the distribution of celebrity content that was taken without their consent from their cloud services, and also, distributed en masse at a rate that was unprecedented. Within moments, they were in every single inbox. Most people had at least knowledge of the incident, also known as the fappening. And this is really a big point of contention within groups, because there's this flippancy around the way that these were distributed, and the onus is on the individual woman herself to reconcile her own identity and to mediate her own content. So one of the major arguments against sort of, or actually one of the major arguments for why the distribution of these photos is acceptable is the notion that this is actually your responsibility. It's naive as Jennifer Lawrence, as another celebrity, to believe that people are so good-hearted that they aren't going to actively pursue trying to find your photographs. So this failure of imagination, it seems as though it also crosses over not just for celebrity photographs, but also for the individual, every woman in here. And also another failure of imagination is the failure to imagine technology that is able to detect you and whatever content you have based on your face. Now, certain advents in technology like OpenCV has allowed us to actually map a 3D image of your countenance through Delaney triangulation and all kinds of chicanery in order to find you in a crowd. Any photo, CCTV, or a casual snap at a bar, something that you may or may not be aware of, can have a fiduciary. A fiduciary is a marker in an image that is used to index different qualities and also index your identity. So we're walking around with these kind of QR codes on our face that identify us in a sea of content. And the aperture can open and close according to the intention of the person who's querying for you, or for a group of people, or for a type of person. That leads me to querying for sexual proxy. So in Queera, there's actually this, there are all kinds of questions that come up. This one is, how do I find a porn actress who looks like my ex-girlfriend by uploading a photo? So this is real, actually. This is not speculative design or design fiction. This is actually a thing. People are interested in finding content that is a little left of center, a little like shy of their target, shy of the object of their desire. And so we wanted to employ the free mechanical Turk engine known as Reddit in order to take a look at how the system would see us. So this is a page called Doppelbanger. It has something like 23,000 subscribers or whatever it is in Reddit. And basically what you do is you submit your photograph no, you don't submit your photograph. You submit the photograph of a comely barista or the woman down the street from you or something like that. And then the denizens of Reddit will come by and take a look at it and see if they can match your face with some kind of lookalike porn star and send you there. So I decided to give it a shot. And so I submitted my photo. I looked a little different back then. There was a lot of great comments about Joker porn and that sort of thing. Because I have green hair, I guess you can't see that from the projector. But so what I discovered was, first of all, I didn't make it to the homepage. You know, this is pure slush pile material. You know, and I thought I was actually going to do better because I had a great. The title of it was. Stuck in the friend zone, need to fuck my green-haired Asian friend. I had a friend actually write that for me. My friend Adam did, so I was really pleased with it. I didn't really understand how to go about that. So, so the submission of the pornographic content itself, it seemed, was not just an input for querying for porn, but actually the pornographic content in and of itself. Just through, there were actually no matches for me, but as you can see, within moments, there were thousands of views for an otherwise unextraordinary photograph. And it seems as though this photo was the material used, and the photo that is submitted is the material used for pornographic content, more so than the proxy that you would find or that you're referred to, which makes me feel a little ambivalent, but whatever, that's cool. So what if we don't rely on human interventions? What if we do things procedurally? So there actually is a service called FaceMatch, and there's also all kinds of different sister sites that do the same thing, probably using the same database and has the same images and same porn stars. And what you do is you take a photograph and you crop it to the face. You have a front-facing photograph that's like very small, and then you enter it into the system after you click the agree to the fine print sort of disclosure, and it matches you to porn stars according to its facial detection algorithm. And in this case, this is Patrick. This is Kate's boyfriend. We were a little timid at first, and we decided to just throw his face up there to see. Well, also because he's not a woman, and also he's wearing glasses and has a beard. And they were able to detect the glasses. I was really impressed with that. So Kate, she is a petite white woman, Caucasian woman, and she had this really kind of terrible small photograph of herself, and we were able to take her top results and do a probability image by superimposing them and aligning the faces together to see what kind of results. And then we created a feedback where we took that superimposed image and we fed it back into the system to see how the system would do. And it actually, it was able to detect some of the same people. It could just be that there are not that many people in this database yet. And my suspicion is that's the case, because for me, I don't think anyone looks like me. But, and also certainly the probability photo, which you're about to see, it does not look a whole lot like me. So this is Kate's, which is actually pretty eerie. As you can see, you have glasses, you have the smile, you have very similar nose, cheekbones. It was actually, this after image was incredibly powerful because it really doesn't look exactly like her, but there's an affinity there that I found to be like really incredibly jarring, especially when you see her in real life. It's difficult. For me, however, not really, not quite, the same. I think there are just not as many women who looked like me in the database. There's just not a large enough pool. So they did get I don't know how they got that. I have naturally dark hair, but yeah, why not? And everything else I think is pretty off. And so these are the two side by side. Hers is much greater fidelity, I'd say. So what are the psychological consequences of converting a lossy after image into high resolution? Certainly the terrain of the imagination and the sexual fantasy is not really in pixels. It's in these gossamer images that move past each other and emanate out of your mind. How do you render that into something that is permanent, that is touchable, that is in front of you? So I wanted to show you guys a quick video.
When Judy, refashioned as Madeleine, steps out of the door, it's like fantasy realized. And of course, we have a name, a perfect name for fantasy realized. It's called nightmare. Fantasy realized. What does this mean? Of course, it is always sustained by an extreme violence. The violence, in this case, of Scottish refashioning, brutal refashioning of Judy, a real common girl, into Madeleine. It's truly a process of mortification.
So this leads into probably, I think, my favorite headline of all time, which is that infamous Spider-Woman cover rendered in 3D is a flesh nightmare. And essentially, the translation from one medium to another leads to artifacts the same way compression of a JPEG image would. There are always going to be things that are elements that are missed and elements that are stretched and enter into the periphery that should never enter. So I decided to talk Kate into making 3D models from these images that we created. And we wanted to perhaps eventually, I don't know, 3D print them or something else. So we used a free software called FaceGen that allows you to photo fit a photograph and create these sort of waypoints in that photograph. And using image processing, it creates a depth map and then interpolates that over an average human face. So with no further ado, there we go. So that's Kate. And that's me. That's not me. That's a ghoul. Oh man, especially when you have like the fade in, it's like it's really menacing. So one thing I wanted to discuss was the fine print, what's happening behind the scenes when you submit a photograph to one of these services. First of all, you basically give up the right, you give up another person's ownership of their likeness. And you're able to essentially repurpose that person's ownership and waive their rights, and also publish these different kinds of companies can publish that content without your consent. And of course, I'm sure they would observe some sort of discretion if you found out through the nether regions of the internet that your photo was being distributed to advertise something like Face Match. But what's the likelihood of that? Also, another interesting point is you cannot submit photographs of people under 18. And there's nothing inherently pornographic about submitting a photograph to a service, but by having this in the fine print, they are acknowledging the fact that querying for pornographic content is a version of pornographic content itself. It takes a photograph and it moves it into a context, despite the context that it was actually taken. So. Technology has enabled us to approach increasingly heightened realities, and the looting of these realities are needed to sustain the erotic. And we need now to understand exactly why and how our photographs are being manipulated. And I wanted to end with two quotes. Is not the most erotic portion of the body where the garment gapes. In perversion, which is the realm of textual pleasure, there is no erogenous zones, a foolish expression. Besides, it is intermittence, a psychoanalysis that has rightly stated which is erotic, the intermittence of skin flashing between two articles of clothing, trousers and sweaters between two edges. And the becoming of man is the history of the exhaustion of his possibilities. And I want to ask you guys today, what are we exhausting when we have a world where any image of any person can be conjured up in an instant? Thank you so much.
So we have one more. We still have 15 minutes. Oliver David is a filmmaker and writer whose work revolves around the concept of prosthetics and memory. His films have screened in London, New York, and Berlin. He's currently living in Brooklyn. He's pursuing an MFA at the School of Visual Arts in the photo, video, and related media program. We have one more computer switch.
Is this going to work? Okay. That's good on one end. Is it good on this end? No. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so it's not quite going back. So this presentation is called Conspiracy Theory 2.0, Photographic Practices on Conspiracy Theory Websites Following the Boston Marathon Bombing. I will be showing some images from that. So this is a photo by Kevin Carter taken in Sudan in 1993, and it demonstrates what Jill DeMillo terms the pornography of the real. It asks us to take visual pleasure in looking at suffering, but it offers no explanation for that suffering. And from the position of a photographer or filmmaker, this is very problematic. And so I had this in mind around the time the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And I noticed my Facebook feed was being full of images like this that were sort of all attached to various forms of conspiracy speech. I thought that it was sort of interesting because it's not how I think about political agency or historical agency as sort of composed of malevolent and omnipotent forces that work covertly. And it's not how I think about photography either. But I was interested in the way people were trying to combine photographic images with other images or with annotations to try and speak about what was happening outside of the frame of the photo to try and explain suffering in a way. So in the academic literature, the definition of conspiracy belief isn't very controversial. It has two terms. It's either to do with covert and self-serving forces, and that these forces are a motive force within history itself. So I came to the working definition of a conspiracy belief as the belief that history is primarily determined by the covert actions of an individual or group working to their own ends. What is slightly more controversial in the literature is the opposite view that theorists posit, an alternative to a conspiracist view. There's the sort of consensus-minded who see neoliberal democracy as fulfilling all its own promises, and then the more Marxist antagonistic theorists who see sort of society as fundamentally shaped by antagonisms. In the field of conspiracy theory research, that would be Karl Popper, Frederick Jameson, Slavoj Žižek as its sort of lead protagonists. And Frederick Jameson's particularly interesting here. He is trying to relate sort of aesthetic practices to political experience under globalized capitalism. And he notes that the phenomenological experience of the subject, which would be the basis of the work of art, becomes distant from the causal basis of experience under globalization. And so he coins the term cognitive mapping to try and describe an individual's ability to understand themselves in terms of globalized class relations. And he says the conspiracy, one is tempted to say, is the poor person's cognitive mapping in the postmodern age. It is a degraded figure of the total logic of late capital, a desperate attempt to represent the latter's system whose failure is marked by its slippages into sheer theme and content. So he sort of sees conspiracy theory as like speaking to a kind of a real problem in a way. So for my research, I looked at two websites, Infowars.com and HangTheBankers.com. Infowars.com has a readership roughly 10% of Fox News, and Hang the Bankers roughly 1% of Fox News. And I just did a sort of content analysis of looking at how these two websites responded to the Boston Marathon bombing, which obviously sprung up huge numbers of conspiracy theories. And what was interesting was these theories sprung up in real time in relation to the news media coverage, and that was the first time this has ever happened. It's made possible by social media and ubiquity of cameras. So, in the analysis, it makes sense to think about each web page as a unit of authorial intent. And these web pages are created by lots of different images taken by different authors that are then annotated by different authors, and the sort of act of conspiracy speech itself is to curate these into a web page. There are various levels on which the images on these sites are taken to be meaningful. The image is taken to show something itself, which would be a sort of photojournalistic register. The juxtaposition of images through collage or annotation, the narrative progression from beginning to end of each web page, and then the sense made by reading across and between websites via hyperlinks or bookmarks, which in practical terms there isn't really a correlate in traditional media. So that's an interesting update. And it's interesting to compare this to sort of the institutional framing of photojournalism, where truth claims are made in an institutional context where people's jobs and professional ethics are at stake. So if we look at here, these 4 images I'm about to show are from Peter Joseph Watkins' post on InfoWars on the 17th of April. And this demonstrates what I term the over and under determinacy of the image. The image is considered to be such a weak guarantor of truth that it's necessary to annotate it, to draw on it, to write alone, brown, black backpack, not watching. And yet at the same time, the salient feature of this image to the author is that the man in the bottom left corner is looking away. So this sort of very circumstantial piece of fact documented by this photograph is taken to have much more weight than the sort of indexical representation within it, which is the sort of unusual rhetorical move you don't see outside of conspiracy sites. Here we see the same site again. Note all the arrows. And what I think is interesting about this is sort of, you can see how many different hands have touched this. There's several different kinds of arrows. Some are hand-drawn, some are drawn by markers. In the bottom right corner, you can see the marks of a previous collage. And normally when we think about photographic veracity, evidence of manipulation is considered a sign of distruthfulness, whereas here it's, as Barkin terms, the internet becomes an echo chamber. So the more times these images get passed around, the more hands you can see in them, the more truthful, more authentic people think they are. So again, this is all from the same web post, and it's the same image again and again and again. And here, a symbol within the image is sort of used to connect these men with the SEAL team, Blackwater, and the Punisher comic book series. I'm not sure he meant that one. But this is sort of, this is fascinating, the idea that you could relate the events captured within a photo to these sort of hugely complex political industrial machinations that happen. It's also the sort of updated version of what Jennifer McGee terms the archetypical conspiracy theory image, which is photos connected by bits of string. It's also, David Fincher uses that in movies a lot. It's sort of anyone trying to look for the truth. That's the image of looking for the truth. So, and then this is the post on hangthebankers.com. I'm not going to talk about the images here. I'm going to talk about just sort of the flow of the web page as a whole. So we begin with user predictions made before the event happened, juxtaposed with the events of the day afterwards. Cut to just before and just after the bombing. And Hang the Bankers is much more fond of a sort of meme-like language than something like InfoWars would be. InfoWars doesn't really go in for this ironic language so much. And then we cut to suspect 1 being escorted away. And notice how filmic this is. Like, there's nothing to identify what this image is, but we've seen an event and then we see darkness and police. And you assume it's the same with scene day, scene night. Like, that's how we make sense of time in film. And then we have a cross-cut to Capitol Hill, and it says, while you were distracted by Boston, Texas, Congress passed CISPA. And I think this cross-cut is also very filmic. It sort of connects one time and place with another time and place and suggests that there's something causally related about them. It's sort of a technique Francis Coppola uses in The Godfather a lot. So, in conclusion, Jameson notes that we should expect that communication technology would appear as an allegorical term because it represents the absence of causes of our experience. And I think we see this here. And the conclusion I took from my research was that there's not really any need to rethink the existing literature on conspiracy theory. Rather, what happens is traditional forms of conspiracy speech are updated with a naive understanding of photographic veracity and a more sophisticated understanding of filmic conventions. Thank you.
So we do have time for a few questions. If anyone's really burning, you should come up close, because I know they want to get them on the microphone, so that way we don't have to pass it all the way to the back. If you're in the back, and we'll check in with Gabi in a minute. But yeah, I think I'm going to start with a question for you, Brian.
Sure.
I had, when you were thinking about the various stages of images, but one with image production, and I know it was specifically in terms of images made by cell phone that you were thinking of, that you were noting. But I think it applies to everything. You noted that it's important to think about some of the restrictions, or especially from some apps, or even the cell phone device itself. I mean, screw that. I mean, even thinking of everyone on this panel, it seems that, when we talk about from screenshots to images today, like almost it's the opposite. Like anything's possible. But then I thought maybe I don't spend enough time thinking about like restrictions and on imagery. And I'm wondering if you can maybe say a little bit more, but maybe respond to some of the other things you heard some of the other folks have.
Sure, happily. I mean, when I think about image production and the limits inherent in image production, my thinking in the cell phone camera starts with the specific limitations that the light chip has, especially compared to a full lens assembly, and how that has its own problems with indexicality, as it was brought up earlier, right? Like you're starting from a point where whatever reality is out there is already inscribed in a way that isn't less true. But it's also true for the way in which light was written on film in the first days that was invented, right? But limits are productive, and I think that's the key takeaway, is that like restrictions on your power are productive in some sort of way too, right? It gives you a field from which to navigate, and I think that's the more useful way to think about how limits turn into apps, turn into a text message interface, right? And how within those confines we start to see how things make sense, right?
Go ahead. No, yeah. I was thinking about porno banger with doppelganger.
Porno banger. Actually, speaking to the limitations of digital photography, I recently was taking a class in digital photography, and the interest. One of the things that really interested me is digital color space and the politics behind digital color space. You have 0 to 255 values for each pixel. That's already incredibly reductive of the spectrum of colors that we see. And another, one of the artifacts of that, consequence that is deeply felt actually in fashion, is that natural dyes actually don't sell as well because they do not photograph within the digital color space. So you see a reduction in the sale of certain items because they do not fit within this new political structure that's created by the affordances of this photograph or whatever.
What you're saying about the limitations being a good thing was really interesting, and I agree with you that limitations are at the heart of what make apps work. Because the more options you have, the more difficult something becomes to use, the more you have decision fatigue, the more time you spend on something, and sort of by narrowing those things away and making it just like you click and you capture it, that's what makes the thing ubiquitous. I was also thinking about that in regards to when you're talking about putting your face on that really creepy search engine. And then having programs like, build up a high-res thing of it, and then having like a 3D mapping thing. And I was thinking about it because I'm an artist, and artists, of course, are like an artist who works by hand, who's drawing all you guys. Artists are like the original creepers, and like, we would just do that by like drawing a person, and without all of the algorithmic help and technology. But there was a high skill barrier to our creepiness that has now been totally surpassed, and the creepiness has been commoditized.
So
just shows the sort of deep connection that you have with your phone. It's this thing that's on you. You have this perspective on it that seems very personal, but at once is shared and has the limitations of its interface or whatever. I think that definitely says something about the sort of idea of authenticity as something that can be gained from expression rather than actual sort of veracity per se, which is a sort of different perspective, I think, on the idea of photo manipulation as inherently false. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess including you in the limitations. I guess what I'm, even more thinking about some of the lines connecting you all today is I have a friend who works at BuzzFeed, and whenever they have a new employee, which is like one a minute now, it's like they have like these threads, like welcome threads, where it's all memes and photos, welcome, cats and people falling out of airplanes. And he was saying the other night how sometimes he thinks that's kind of limiting. There's like it's almost like you have this visual language that he feels, because he's an engineer, that it's kind of maybe limiting. And I don't know, I'm thinking of the screenshot thing that it just seems that all of this is evolving so fast. I wouldn't really look at that as I would say that he's dead wrong. It seems to be that even with the face, some of the stuff that you showed us now, that if we're really looking at how people are using images now, again, coming back to the idea of focusing on what might sort of be restrictions is less fruitful than perhaps looking at just how much is possible. But that's not really the question. So let's open it up here. Yep.
So this was a wonderful, very cool panel. But I want to ask one question, not in a friendly way. So I was struck as out of 5 presentations that these 3 people explicitly talked about indexicality and authenticity. And it was very natural, except now that we take a little longer historical view, this was in fact the main term, which accompanied discussions of photography since the 80s. Let's speak about the 80s, the early 90s, and the 90s, and it's interesting that the photography has changed, and there have been other terms of data science, algorithms, and databases, and images capturing from device, and yet people said very fantastic things about authenticity, and yet it's seems to be this one concept just keeps wanting. It's all they talk about the image, how can we get out of it? I like what you guys said. I think you guys said some fresh things, but it's just interesting that for 30 years of photography, it's one of the term that seems to be dominating all discussions still.
Who wants to take that?
I think that's sort of what I was trying to get toward in my looking at screenshots, is that the idea of the ideology of documentation or whatever is used actually to sort of negate that by people, so people are recognizing it as something that is, and it's part of our landscape, I think, how people view truth. So I kind of wanted to look at how expression is able to use that as sort of the way aesthetic.
We have 2 minutes left, so you guys, who's ready to go?
Do you want to go?
Yeah. I find it very interesting how sort of everyone knows photos lie, are manipulated, can be constructed, can be rendered, and yet it's the idea of indexicality haunts lay discourse in this still very extreme way. We still tend to parse photos as representations of real things. So I think it's something that will sort of remain in critical discourse as well. It's very hard to separate, especially at a time when photography is becoming so ubiquitous, so dispersed, such a communal activity. It's hard to move beyond that entirely, I think.
I think we also cannot ignore the political power loaded in claiming authenticity. and especially claiming an authentic record, right? As if to say, what has happened has mattered and is deserving of your attention, right? And that's the locus around which I think manipulation occurs. And thinking about it as a strategic act within a certain situation is probably more useful than to, but it also requires to divorce it from the representation itself and instead look at the social context of that representation.
I mean, photos, in addition to being art and expression, are also proof, and that's why the discourse around them being authentic is so important. You know, photos are how you might prove someone died in a war zone, or you might prove that a cop choked a man to death, as well as, you know, being a way that you try to prove that you're young and hot, even though maybe you Photoshop the hell out of yourself. So photos are always in this liminal space where they're like being used to prove things in a very legalistic sense with very real consequences, and also being used to express all sorts of purely personal things, and there's always that conflict between the two.
All right, let's give a big round of applause.
Do you know the work of James Tracy? He's in Florida